My mother-in-law pretended to be broke for years and drained her children for $300,000, but we found out that she was a secret millionaire. My mother-in-law Brenda had everyone convinced she was a destitute widow, barely surviving on Social Security, who needed constant financial help and support from her 3 adult children. She'd call my husband Alan crying about choosing between medication and groceries, so we'd send her $500. She'd text his brother Carl about her electricity being shut off so he'd pay her utility bills. She'd tell his sister Kendall that her roof was leaking, but she couldn't afford repairs, so Kendall took out a loan to fix it. Every single month there was a new crisis that required immediate cash. She lived in this tiny, run-down apartment that smelled like cat pee and had furniture from the 1970s held together with duct tape. Whenever we visited, she'd serve us expired crackers and apologize for not having real food, but you know how it is on a fixed income. She wore the same 3 outfits with holes in them and shoes that were falling apart. If anyone suggested she move in with one of us, she'd say she couldn't bear to be a burden and would rather die in poverty with dignity. The manipulation went beyond money. Brenda would guilt Alan into spending every weekend doing repairs on her apartment because she couldn't afford a handyman. Carl drove her everywhere because she claimed she couldn't afford car insurance. Kendall cleaned her apartment weekly because Brenda's arthritis supposedly prevented her from basic chores, even though she seemed fine when she wanted to be. She'd forgotten Kendall's birthday for 10 years but never forgot to call when rent was due. We were hemorrhaging money keeping Brenda afloat while trying to save for our own kids' college funds. Alan worked overtime, constantly stressed about his poor mother struggling to survive. Carl's wife almost left him because he kept prioritizing Brenda's manufactured emergencies over their family. Kendall went into therapy because of the guilt Brenda piled on her for not doing enough, despite Kendall basically funding Brenda's entire existence. Brenda would play her children against each other too. She'd tell Alan that Carl never helped with money, making Alan feel like he had to compensate. She'd tell Kendall that her brothers thought she was selfish, so Kendall would give even more to prove them wrong. She created this competitive dynamic where everyone was trying to be the good child, by sacrificing the most. For 8 years, this woman drained us financially and emotionally. She missed grandkids' birthdays, claiming she couldn't afford gifts but expected lavish celebrations for her own. She'd refuse to come to family dinners at restaurants because she couldn't reciprocate, then guilt us for excluding her. She monopolized every holiday with her tears about spending them alone and poor. The truth came out when Brenda had a minor stroke and was hospitalized. Alan rushed to her bedside, and when the doctor said she'd need temporary rehabilitation care, Alan started panicking about how to pay for it. He asked to speak with the billing department about charity care or payment plans. The administrator looked confused and said, "Mrs. Art Coleman has excellent insurance, plus she's private pay anyway." Alan said there must be some mistake, his mother had no money. The administrator pulled up her account and showed Alan that Brenda had listed assets of over $2 million and had been paying for a premium Medicare supplement that covered everything. Alan thought it was identity theft or some kind of error until the administrator showed him Brenda's signature on all the forms. He called Carl and Kendall to the hospital and they started investigating. Kendall went to Brenda's apartment to get her important papers and found a hidden filing cabinet behind stacks of newspapers. Inside were bank statements showing 3 separate investment accounts worth over $800,000 each. There were property deeds for 2 rental houses in Florida generating $6,000 a month in income. There were quarterly statements from her late husband's pension that she'd been receiving for 15 years worth $4,000 a month. She had been getting nearly $10,000 a month while crying poverty to her children. Carl calculated that over 8 years the 3 siblings had given Brenda approximately $300,000 in cash and assistance, while she sat on millions. Kendall found receipts in the cabinet too. Cruises Brenda took while telling them she was too sick to travel. Designer clothes shipped to a P.O. box. Restaurant receipts from expensive steakhouses dated on days she claimed to be starving. Even receipts for a car she kept in a storage unit because she didn't want anyone to know she could drive. When Brenda woke up, her children were standing around her bed with all the evidence spread across her hospital tray. Alan said, "Mom, we found everything. The money, the properties, the lies. How could you do this to us?" Brenda immediately started crying. Her hands shook and reached toward Alan like she'd done 1,000 times before when she needed him to rescue her from whatever crisis she'd invented that week. Alan took a step back from the hospital bed and I watched something change in his face. He told her we weren't going to listen to more lies, and his voice came out flat and cold in a way I'd never heard him speak to his mother. Carl's knuckles went white where he gripped the metal bed rail, and I could see the muscles in his jaw working like he was trying not to yell. Kendall just stood there staring at the bank statements spread across the hospital tray, showing over $2 million while tears ran down her face silently. Brenda's crying got louder and she tried reaching for Alan's hand again, saying she could explain everything, and we didn't understand the full situation. I stepped closer to my husband and watched him pull his hand away from his mother, for what I'm pretty sure was the first time in his entire life. The look on Brenda's face when he did that was pure shock, like she couldn't believe her manipulation wasn't working anymore. Carl's voice came out rough when he told her they'd calculated the total, and it was $300,000 over 8 years while she sat on millions. He asked what possible explanation could make that okay, and Brenda switched tactics immediately. She started talking about protecting the money for their inheritance, and how she didn't want them to know about her wealth because then they'd stop visiting and only care about the money. Kendall made this sound that was half laugh and half sob, and said that Brenda had taken out a loan in Kendall's name for a roof that didn't need fixing while sitting on $800,000 in liquid assets. The nurse came in right then to check Brenda's vitals, and we all went silent, but the tension in that room felt like it could crack the walls. I could hear the blood pressure machine beeping and the nurse writing numbers on her chart while none of us moved or spoke. The nurse looked between us and must have sensed something because she finished up quickly and left without the usual small talk. As soon as the door closed, Alan told Brenda we were leaving, and she shouldn't expect any of them to help with her rehabilitation care. Brenda's tears changed from the practiced crying to real panic, and she started saying she'd had a stroke and needed her family. Her voice got higher and more desperate, and she kept reaching toward Alan like if she could just touch him, she could pull him back under her control. Carl stepped forward and told her she should use some of her millions to hire private care, since she clearly didn't need them for anything except money and labor. We walked out together and left her calling after us, and I didn't look back even though I could hear her voice getting louder. The three of us ended up in Alan's truck in the hospital parking lot, and nobody said anything for a long time. I sat in the passenger seat while Carl and Kendall were in the back, and we all just stared at different spots through the windshield. My hands were shaking and I realized I'd been holding my breath. Kendall finally broke the silence by saying she couldn't believe we fell for it for 8 years, and that we were all idiots. I turned around to look at her and told her we weren't idiots, but we were people who loved someone who deliberately used that love against us, and that's completely different. Alan's hands were gripping the steering wheel even though the truck wasn't running, and I could see his chest moving like he was trying to breathe steady. Carl pulled out his phone and called Myra, and I could hear her voice through the speaker before he even got it to his ear. She was almost shouting with relief, asking if it was true about the money, and Carl said yes. It was all true and worse than they'd thought. Myra started talking fast about how she'd been telling Carl for years that something didn't add up about Brenda's constant emergencies, and I heard Carl's voice crack when he told his wife she was right, and he was sorry he didn't listen sooner. I watched the weight lifting off Carl's shoulders even though his face was still tight with anger. He stayed on the phone with Myra for maybe 10 minutes while she asked questions, and he answered them, and by the end of the call, he was sitting up straighter. Alan started the truck and asked where we wanted to go because none of us were ready to go home yet. Kendall suggested the diner near the hospital, and we drove there in silence except for the sound of the turn signal clicking. We ordered coffee that none of us touched, and Kendall pulled out the folder of evidence she'd brought from Brenda's apartment. The receipts were spread across the table between our cold coffee cups, and they made me so angry I had to clench my fists under the table. There was a receipt for a $300 dinner at a steakhouse dated the same week Brenda called Alan crying about not being able to afford groceries. Kendall had found at least a dozen cruise bookings while Brenda was telling us she was too sick and poor to travel to family events. Carl picked up a receipt for a spa day that cost more than he'd sent Brenda for her supposed electric bill that month. Alan was going through a stack of bank statements and his finger stopped on one page. He showed us receipts for a storage unit we didn't know about, and Carl immediately said we needed to see what else she was hiding. We paid for the coffee nobody drank and drove to the storage facility that afternoon. Kendall had found the key in Brenda's hidden filing cabinet, and the address was on the receipts. The facility was one of those places with rows of orange doors and security codes, and we used Brenda's paperwork to get through the gate. Unit 247 was near the back, and when Carl unlocked it and pulled up the door, we all just stood there staring. There was a car inside, and not some old beater, but a sedan that looked almost new with shiny paint and clean seats. This was the car Brenda kept hidden while Carl drove her everywhere for 2 years because she supposedly couldn't afford insurance. Carl walked around the car touching the hood like he couldn't believe it was real, and Alan opened the driver's door to look inside. The registration in the glove box was in Brenda's name and dated from 3 years ago. Behind the car were boxes stacked against the walls, and Kendall started opening them with shaking hands. Designer clothes with tags still attached spilled out of the first box, and the second one had expensive jewelry in velvet cases. Kendall found more financial documents showing investments we hadn't known about, and a folder of property tax bills for the Florida rental houses. Then she opened a box near the back and just started crying. Inside were birthday cards for all the grandchildren with prices still on them from fancy stores. These were cards that cost more than the I can't afford gifts excuses Brenda gave every single year. Kendall held up a card meant for her daughter's 8th birthday last year with a $50 price tag, while Brenda had told Kendall she couldn't afford even a small present. Alan stood in the middle of the storage unit looking at his mother's car and all her hidden wealth, and said he didn't even know who she was anymore. His voice came out quiet and lost, and I wanted to hug him, but I didn't know if he wanted to be touched right then. We loaded some of the most important financial documents into Alan's truck, and locked the storage unit back up. Nobody suggested telling Brenda we'd found it because what would be the point? The next week was strange because our phones kept ringing with Brenda's number and none of us answered. She left voicemails that started with apologies but turned into guilt trips within seconds. The hospital social worker kept calling too about discharge planning and rehabilitation placement. Her name was Kathleen Dowling, and she sounded tired on the voicemails asking us to call back about arrangements for Brenda's care. Alan finally answered on the 5th call, and I listened to his side of the conversation. He told Kathleen coldly that Brenda had more than enough money to arrange her own care, and to please stop calling us about it. There was a long pause where I could hear Kathleen's voice, but not her words. And then Alan said, yes, he was serious. And no, we wouldn't be helping. Kathleen said something else, and Alan's face softened just a little. He thanked her and hung up and told me she'd said she would note the family situation in Brenda's file, and that she understood. Having someone outside the family acknowledge that we weren't being cruel helped more than I expected it to. That weekend, Carl and Myra came over to our house for dinner, and the tension in the room felt heavy before anyone even sat down. Myra set her purse on the counter and pulled out a small spiral notebook with a worn cover, and I could see Carl's face change when he recognized it. She opened it on the kitchen table while I was still getting plates out, and said she needed to show us something she'd been keeping track of for the past 3 years. The pages were filled with dates and dollar amounts and descriptions written in Myra's neat handwriting. Every single request Brenda had made to Carl was documented there with the date and how much money he'd given, or how many hours he'd spent helping her. Myra had tracked everything from the $200 electric bill payments to the weekends Carl spent fixing Brenda's sink or driving her to doctor appointments she probably didn't need. Carl sat down at the table and started reading through it, and his face went pale and then green like he might actually throw up. The total at the bottom of the last page said $60,000 in cash, plus 427 hours of labor over 3 years. Myra said quietly that she was relieved we all finally knew the truth, but she was also angry it took this long for everyone to see what she'd been seeing all along. She said she'd felt crazy for years thinking Brenda's stories didn't add up, but everyone treated her like she was being cruel to doubt a poor old widow. Carl looked up from the notebook with tears in his eyes and apologized again for not believing her sooner. He said he was sorry for choosing his mother's lies over his wife's truth, and for almost destroying their marriage because he couldn't see what was right in front of him. Myra reached across the table and took his hand, but I could see the hurt was still there even if she was trying to forgive him. Alan stood at the stove stirring pasta and said nothing, but I saw his jaw working like he was grinding his teeth. The notebook sat open on the table showing 3 years of documented manipulation, and I wondered if Alan and Kendall had similar records in their own lives that they just hadn't written down. Kendall called right in the middle of dinner, and her voice coming through the phone speaker was shaking with fresh anger. She said she'd gone back to Brenda's apartment to look more carefully, and found a second filing cabinet hidden in the bedroom closet behind a bunch of old coats. This one had even more papers than the first, including tax returns going back 10 years. Kendall said she was looking at returns that showed Brenda earning over $100,000 every single year from investments and rental income. She'd filed taxes on all of it, which meant the government knew about the money while Brenda was calling her children crying about not being able to afford groceries. Kendall kept saying she couldn't believe it, and her voice got higher and more upset with each word. She said Brenda had signed these tax returns every April while taking money from her kids every month, and the level of planning that took made it so much worse than just lying. Carl asked if Kendall was still at the apartment, and she said yes, and that she was taking pictures of everything with her phone, because she wanted proof that this actually happened. Myra suggested Kendall leave and come over to our house, but Kendall said she needed to finish going through everything first. After Kendall hung up, we all just sat there staring at our half-eaten dinner, and nobody seemed to want to keep eating. I finally said what I'd been thinking, which was that we needed to talk to a lawyer to understand our options. Alan looked up and agreed immediately. He said we weren't just hurt anymore, but we needed to know if what Brenda did was actually illegal, or if we just had to accept that our mother was a con artist who targeted her own children. Carl pulled out his phone and started searching for elder law attorneys in our area. He found one named Paul Mahoney, whose website said he handled cases involving financial abuse and family conflicts. Carl called the office right there from our kitchen table even though it was Saturday evening, and left a message explaining briefly that 3 siblings needed to consult about their mother's financial deception. Paul's office called back Monday morning, and his assistant said he could meet with all 3 siblings together that Wednesday afternoon. The 3 days waiting for the appointment felt long and strange. We kept finding new things that made the situation worse. Alan went through his own bank records and calculated that we'd given Brenda $48,000 over 8 years, not counting the value of his labor. Kendall sent photos of the tax returns showing rental income from properties Brenda claimed she couldn't afford to maintain. Carl found receipts for a cruise. Brenda took the same month she'd called him crying about her electricity being shut off. Wednesday afternoon, we all met at Paul Mahoney's office in a building downtown. The waiting room had leather chairs and magazines about retirement planning, which felt darkly funny given why we were there. Paul came out to get us himself and shook each of our hands before leading us back to his office. He was maybe 60 with gray hair and glasses, and he had us all sit around a conference table while he took notes. We took turns explaining what happened, starting with Alan describing the hospital discovery, and then Kendall talking about the hidden filing cabinets, and Carl showing him Myra's notebook of tracked requests. Paul listened without interrupting and wrote things down on a yellow legal pad. When we finished, he sat back in his chair and said that while Brenda's behavior was definitely wrong, it was going to be very hard to do anything about it legally. He explained that elder financial abuse laws are designed to protect elderly people from being exploited, not to address situations where the elderly person is doing the exploiting. Since we'd all given money voluntarily in response to what we believed were real needs, there wasn't clear legal ground to stand on. Paul said we could potentially sue for fraud, but it would be expensive and time-consuming and emotionally awful, with no promise that we'd win or get any money back. He said judges are often reluctant to rule against elderly parents in family disputes, and Brenda could claim she really did need the money, or that she was just testing whether we loved her. The disappointment in the room felt thick and heavy. Kendall asked if there was anything at all we could do, and Paul thought for a minute before answering. He said if Brenda ever tried to claim she needed Medicaid or other government assistance in the future, we should immediately report her actual assets to prevent fraud against the state. He also said we should document everything for our own protection, in case Brenda tried to claim later that we'd been stealing from her or not taking care of her properly. That idea made Kendall so angry she pushed her chair back from the table and stood up. She said she couldn't believe that after everything Brenda did to us, we now had to worry about her lying about us too. Paul said unfortunately, in his experience, people who are willing to deceive their children about money are often willing to make other false claims to play victim. Kendall walked out of the office and I heard her in the hallway taking deep breaths. Alan asked Paul directly if we had any legal obligation to help with Brenda's care, given that she'd lied to us for years. Paul said no, absolutely not. He explained that adult children have no legal duty to provide care or financial support to a parent, especially one who has substantial assets of her own. He said Brenda made a choice to deceive us rather than being honest, and we were completely allowed to set boundaries to protect ourselves and our families. Hearing that from a lawyer who'd probably seen hundreds of family situations made Alan's shoulders relax for the first time since we'd sat down. Paul said he knew it felt wrong to step back from a parent, but that our first responsibility was to our own mental health and our own children. We left his office with more clarity, but not the answers we'd hoped for. There was no legal magic that would make Brenda take responsibility, or give back the money, or even just apologize sincerely. 2 days after meeting with Paul, I got a call from Kathleen at the hospital. She said Brenda was discharged to a rehabilitation place, and she was calling to let us know. I asked her directly if Brenda's insurance and assets were covering all the care, and Kathleen said yes. She said Brenda had excellent coverage and substantial resources, and then she paused before adding quietly that she'd seen this kind of family dynamic before in her work. She said she wanted to encourage us to take care of ourselves, and that we shouldn't feel guilty about setting boundaries. Her kindness after everything made me start crying right there on the phone. I thanked her and she said she hoped things got easier for us. After I hung up, I told Alan what Kathleen said, and he looked relieved that Brenda's care was handled without us. That evening, Myra came over without Carl and suggested we all see a family therapist together to deal with what had happened. Alan's first reaction was to say that therapy was for people with real problems. I reminded him that being lied to and used by your mother for 8 years was a real problem. Kendall called while we were talking and said she'd been in therapy for years trying to deal with guilt that Brenda had deliberately created, and she thought family sessions were a good idea. Alan finally agreed, but I could tell he was uncomfortable with the whole concept. We found a therapist named Adelaide Hampton who said on her website that she worked with family problems and financial abuse situations. Her first available appointment was the following Tuesday. The 3 siblings went together without spouses for that first visit. Adelaide's office was in a small building with a waiting room that had soft chairs and boxes of tissues on every table. She came out to get them and brought them back to her office, which had big windows and plants on the shelves. Adelaide asked them to explain what brought them in, and they took turns telling the story. Alan described finding out about the money at the hospital. Carl talked about the storage unit and the hidden car. Kendall explained the filing cabinets and tax returns. Adelaide listened and took notes and didn't interrupt except to ask clarifying questions. When they finished, she said that just hearing them tell the story out loud probably made the whole thing feel more real. Kendall said it did, and that she kept thinking, how did we not see this sooner? Adelaide said gently that they didn't see it because Brenda was very skilled at manipulation, and because they were programmed to trust their mother. She said children are taught to believe their parents and to help family members in need, and Brenda had used those normal, healthy instincts against them. The second session happened a week later, and Adelaide started by asking each of them to describe their relationship with Brenda before they found out the truth. Alan said he'd always felt like the responsible one as the oldest son. He said he grew up believing it was his job to take care of Mom, and to be the good child who never caused problems. Carl said he spent his whole life walking on eggshells trying to keep everyone happy, and feeling like nothing he did was ever enough. Kendall started crying before she even got words out. She said she'd spent years feeling guilty all the time, like no matter how much she sacrificed or how much she gave, it was never going to be enough to make her mother love her properly. Adelaide wrote things down while they talked, and when Kendall finished, she said that Brenda had created these feelings deliberately to keep all 3 of them competing for approval and opening their wallets. Adelaide leaned forward in her chair and asked us to think about what Brenda actually got from all this beyond the $300,000. She said money was obviously part of it, but there had to be more because Brenda already had millions and didn't need our cash. Carl looked confused and said he didn't understand what else there could be. Adelaide explained that Brenda got control over all of us. She got attention whenever she wanted it. She got the satisfaction of having 3 adult children drop everything and come running whenever she called. Kendall wiped her eyes and said that's sick, and Adelaide agreed it was unhealthy, but it was also deliberate. She asked Alan what he thought his role was in the family growing up, and Alan said he was the protector, the one who fixed things and took care of everyone. Adelaide pointed out that Brenda had trained him for that role from childhood, so she could exploit it as an adult. She said Brenda's whole identity became wrapped up in being the struggling widow who needed saving, and she wasn't willing to give up that role even when it meant lying to and using her own children. Alan sat there processing this and finally said it made sense in a horrible way, because his mother had always defined herself by her struggles and her needs. Carl added that Brenda seemed almost proud sometimes when she talked about how hard her life was, like suffering was her main personality trait. Adelaide nodded and said, "That's exactly right." Brenda had built her entire sense of self around being the victim who needed rescue, and admitting she had money would have meant giving up the identity she'd constructed over decades. Kendall asked how someone could do that to their own kids, and Adelaide said gently that people with certain personality patterns can compartmentalize in ways that let them justify almost anything. She said Brenda probably told herself she deserved the attention and help because she'd been a good mother, or because she'd suffered when their father died, or because her children owed her. The session ended with Adelaide giving us homework to think about what we each needed going forward. Not what Brenda needed, but what would help us heal. 3 weeks went by, and none of us heard from Brenda directly because we weren't answering her calls. She started leaving voicemails instead, and at first they sounded apologetic. Carl saved them all and brought his phone to our next therapy session. He played the first message on speaker, and we heard Brenda's shaky voice saying she was sorry we were upset, and she understood we needed time. But then 30 seconds later in the same message, her tone shifted and she started talking about being all alone in the rehabilitation facility, with nobody visiting her even though she'd had a stroke. She said she could barely walk and the food was terrible and she didn't understand why her children were being so cruel. Adelaide stopped the playback and pointed out how fast Brenda moved from taking responsibility to making herself the victim. She said that's a classic manipulation pattern where someone offers a non-apology and then immediately pivots to how they're suffering. Carl played another message from a week later where Brenda didn't even bother with the apology part, she just launched straight into complaints about being abandoned. Adelaide asked us how listening to these messages made us feel, and Alan said angry because Brenda still wasn't getting it. Kendall said she felt guilty even though she knew she shouldn't, and Adelaide said that guilt response was exactly what Brenda was counting on. She said Brenda was testing to see if the old buttons still worked, if she could still make us feel bad enough to come running. We all agreed right there in Adelaide's office that we needed to maintain no contact while we processed everything, that answering Brenda or visiting her would just restart the cycle. The following week, Kendall came to therapy looking exhausted and admitted that part of her wanted to forgive Brenda, just to make the uncomfortable feelings stop. She said being estranged from her mother felt wrong even though she knew intellectually that Brenda had done terrible things. Adelaide warned us that reconciliation without Brenda taking real accountability would just reset the cycle of abuse. She said if we went back to a relationship with Brenda before she genuinely acknowledged what she'd done and why it was harmful, we'd just be teaching her that she could get away with it. Adelaide encouraged us to sit with the discomfort rather than rushing to fix the relationship just because estrangement felt bad. She said uncomfortable feelings weren't dangerous, they were just uncomfortable, and we needed to learn to tolerate them instead of doing whatever it took to make them stop. This was hard for all of us, but especially for Alan, because he'd been raised to believe family comes first no matter what. He said his whole life he'd been taught that you don't turn your back on family, that blood is thicker than water, that parents deserve respect. Adelaide gently pointed out that those values were good in healthy families, but Brenda had weaponized them against him. She said real family relationships are built on mutual respect and honesty, not manipulation and exploitation. Adelaide suggested that Myra join us for the next session, because she'd watched the manipulation from outside the family dynamic. Myra came and sat next to Carl looking nervous about speaking up. Adelaide asked her to describe what she'd observed over the years, and Myra started talking about all the things that never made sense to her. She said she'd tried to tell Carl for years that Brenda's stories had holes in them. Like, why would someone with no money take a taxi to the grocery store instead of accepting Carl's offer to shop for her? Why did Brenda's emergencies always happen right after Carl got paid? Why could Brenda never provide receipts or documentation for the things she claimed to need money for? Myra said she'd felt crazy for questioning a poor old widow's needs, and Carl's family had made her feel like she was cruel and selfish for doubting Brenda. Hearing Myra lay it all out made Carl realize how much damage his mother's lies had done to his marriage. He sat there with his head in his hands while Myra described years of fighting about money and priorities. Years of feeling like she came second to Brenda's manufactured crises. Myra's voice cracked when she talked about almost leaving Carl because she couldn't take being married to someone who chose his manipulative mother over his wife and their future together. Carl turned to Myra right there in front of all of us and apologized for choosing his mother's manufactured needs over her legitimate concerns. He said he was sorry for making her feel crazy. Sorry for prioritizing Brenda's lies over their marriage. Sorry for all the years he didn't believe her when she tried to tell him something was wrong. Myra started crying and said she'd waited so long to hear him say that. She told him she accepted his apology, but rebuilding trust would take time because she'd spent years feeling like she was the problem, like she was a bad person for doubting Brenda's stories. Adelaide helped them talk through what moving forward would look like, asking Carl what specific actions he could take to show Myra he'd changed. Carl promised to never send Brenda money again without discussing it with Myra first, to never prioritize his mother's wants over his wife's needs, to believe Myra when she said something felt off. By the end of the session, I could see them holding hands, and it was the first positive thing to come from this whole mess. Kendall said watching Carl and Myra work through it gave her hope that something good could come from the pain, That night, Alan and I stayed up late talking about what all this meant for our kids' college funds. We'd been telling them for years that we couldn't save much because we had to help Grandma Brenda. Now we had to explain that Grandma had been lying and we'd been fooled. Alan worried about what this would teach our children about trust and family. He said he didn't want them growing up cynical or thinking they couldn't trust anyone. I pointed out that it also taught them about boundaries and not accepting bad treatment even from people you love. I said our kids needed to learn that love doesn't mean letting someone hurt you. That family doesn't mean tolerating abuse. Alan nodded, but I could tell he was struggling with it because his whole worldview had been built on the idea that you sacrifice for family no matter what. We decided we needed to tell the kids the truth soon before they heard a confused version from someone else. The next evening, we sat down with our teenage kids at the kitchen table and told them what Grandma Brenda had done. Our daughter's mouth fell open when Alan explained about the hidden millions and the 8 years of lies. Our son looked confused at first, and then angry when he understood that Brenda had been pretending to be poor while they'd been told the family couldn't afford things because of helping Grandma. Our daughter asked if this meant we'd have more money now, and Alan had to explain that the money we'd given was gone, and we couldn't get it back. She looked disappointed and then guilty for being disappointed. Our son asked if we were still going to see Grandma, and we told him honestly that we didn't know yet. We said we needed time to figure out what a relationship with her would look like if we had one at all. Our daughter wanted to know why Grandma would do something like that, and I didn't have a good answer except that sometimes people have problems that make them hurt the people who love them. Having to explain this to our children made the betrayal feel fresh all over again, because we had to see it through their eyes and watch their view of their grandmother shatter. 2 days later, Kendall called me crying so hard I could barely understand her. She'd been going through her finances, trying to make a plan for the future, and realized the loan she'd taken out for Brenda's roof repair would take her 3 more years to pay off. She said she was 32 years old and couldn't buy a house or start a family because she was drowning in debt from a repair that was completely unnecessary. I listened to her rage and grief and didn't try to make her feel better because there was nothing I could say that would make this better right now. Kendall talked about all the things she'd put off because of that loan payment, all the opportunities she'd missed, all the times she'd said no to trips or experiences because she had to send money to the bank for Brenda's fake emergency. She said the worst part was that she'd felt guilty about the loan, like she wasn't doing enough even though she'd gone into debt for her mother. I stayed on the phone with her for over an hour while she cried and raged, and finally she said she needed to go, but thank you for listening. After we hung up, I sat there feeling helpless because I couldn't fix this for her, couldn't give her back those 3 years, or that money, or the peace of mind she'd lost. In our next therapy session, Adelaide introduced something she called ambiguous loss, which she said meant grieving someone who was still alive, but was no longer the person you thought they were. Alan struggled with this concept because his mother was still living and breathing, still calling and leaving messages, still existing in the world. But Adelaide helped him see that the mother he thought he had never actually existed, the woman who called crying about choosing between medicine and food while sitting on millions, wasn't the struggling widow Alan had been trying to save. She was a stranger wearing his mother's face. Kendall said it felt like her real mother had died and been replaced by this person who looked the same, but was completely different. Carl added that he kept having moments where he'd think about calling his mom to tell her something, and then remember that his mom wasn't who he thought she was. Adelaide said this type of grief was complicated because there was no funeral or closure, just an ongoing process of accepting that the person you loved wasn't real. She said we needed to grieve the mothers we thought we had while also dealing with the real woman who deceived us. 4 weeks after the hospital confrontation, Brenda was discharged from the rehabilitation facility back to her apartment. She called Alan within an hour of getting home, and his phone lit up with her name while we were eating dinner. Alan stared at it and then answered on speaker. Brenda's voice came through weak and shaky, begging him to come help her get settled because she was so weak and alone. She said she could barely walk and needed someone to unpack her things and make sure she had food. Alan took a breath and said no. Just that one word, flat and final. Brenda started crying and saying she could fall and die and it would be his fault, that she'd just gotten out of the hospital and needed her son. I watched my husband's face as he recognized the manipulation tactic that had worked on him for decades, watched him see it clearly for the first time. He said again that the answer was no, that Brenda had the resources to hire help and he wasn't coming. Brenda's voice shifted from weak to angry in an instant, and she started to say something about ungrateful children, but Alan hung up while she was mid-sentence. He sat there staring at his phone, and then looked at me with tears in his eyes. He said that was the first time in his entire life he'd told his mother no, and meant it. That same evening, Carl's phone lit up with Brenda's name, and he answered on speaker so Myra could hear. Brenda used the exact same script she'd tried on Alan, the weak voice begging for help getting settled at home, claiming she could barely walk and needed someone to unpack her things. Carl took a breath and said no, he wasn't coming. Brenda started the guilt trip about falling and dying alone, but Carl hung up before she could finish the sentence. Myra grabbed his hand and squeezed it, and I could see the relief on Carl's face even though his hands were shaking. 20 minutes later, Kendall's phone rang during her therapy session with Adelaide. Kendall looked at the screen and saw it was Brenda, and Adelaide suggested she answer on speaker so they could work through it together in real time. Kendall hit the speaker button and Brenda's voice filled the small office, trembling and weak as she begged Kendall to come help her because her brothers had abandoned her, and she was all alone and scared. Adelaide wrote something on her notepad and held it up for Kendall to see, coaching her through setting a boundary. Kendall's voice shook, but she managed to say that Brenda had the resources to hire help, and that Kendall needed space to process everything that had happened. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Brenda's voice changed completely. The weak trembling disappeared and was replaced by anger as she called Kendall selfish and ungrateful, saying she'd raised 3 children who didn't care if their mother died alone. Kendall's face went white, but she pressed the end call button and dropped the phone on the couch next to her. Adelaide waited a moment and then pointed out that we'd all just heard Brenda show her true self, that when manipulation didn't work, she went straight to anger and insults. She asked Kendall to notice that in all the phone calls and messages since the hospital, Brenda hadn't once offered a genuine apology or acknowledged the harm she'd caused. Every single contact had been about what Brenda wanted and needed, with no recognition of what she'd done to us or how it had affected our lives. Adelaide said this pattern was important to see clearly, because it showed that Brenda wasn't sorry for lying and stealing. She was just upset that her children weren't playing along anymore. Kendall nodded slowly and said she'd been feeling guilty about not helping her sick mother, but hearing that shift from weak to angry made something click. The mother who needed help was fake, just another performance to get what she wanted. 3 days later, Alan came home from work with an envelope in his hand, and I could see from his face that it was from Brenda. He didn't open it, just set it on the kitchen counter and stared at it through dinner. That night, he asked if we could bring it to therapy the next week and open it there, and I agreed that was probably smart. When our next session came around, Alan brought the envelope with shaking hands, and Adelaide suggested we read it together in a safe space where we could process whatever it said. Alan tore open the envelope and pulled out 2 pages of Brenda's handwriting, and he started reading out loud. The letter began with the words that made my stomach turn. She wrote that she was sorry we were upset, not sorry for what she'd done, just sorry we had feelings about it. Then she launched into explanations for why she'd felt justified in deceiving us for 8 years. She wrote that she'd been so lonely after our father died, and she'd wanted to see her children more often. She said she didn't trust that we loved her for herself rather than her money, so she'd needed to test our devotion by hiding her wealth. She explained that keeping the Poverty Act going had let her see who we really were and whether we'd help family in need. There was paragraph after paragraph of reasons and explanations, but nowhere in the entire letter did she acknowledge that what she'd done was wrong. She never said the words that she'd lied or stolen or manipulated us. It was all just context for why she'd felt she had to deceive her own children and drain them financially while sitting on millions. Carl was at the session that day, and he grabbed the letter from Alan's hands and read through it again. He pointed out that even in her apology letter, Brenda was making herself the victim and blaming us for her choices. She'd written that if we had visited more often without being asked, she wouldn't have needed to create emergencies to see us. If we had loved her properly, she wouldn't have needed to test whether that love was real. Adelaide set down her pen and explained that this was a classic manipulation tactic called DARVO, which stood for Deny, Attack, Reverse, Victim, and Offender. Brenda was denying responsibility for her actions, attacking our character by implying we didn't love her enough, and positioning herself as the real victim who'd been forced to lie because of our failures as children. Adelaide said this kind of non-apology was actually worse than no apology at all, because it added insult to injury by making us responsible for her choices. Kendall asked if she could have a copy of the letter, and Adelaide made photocopies for each of us. That week, Kendall sat down at her kitchen table and wrote her own letter in response. Not to send, but just as a way to process everything. She started listing every sacrifice she'd made over the 8 years, beginning with the $20,000 loan she'd taken out for the roof repair that was never needed. She wrote about the weekly cleaning visits where she'd scrubbed Brenda's bathroom and kitchen, while Brenda watched TV and complained. She listed the missed opportunities with friends because Brenda had needed something, and Kendall had dropped everything to help. She calculated the therapy bills she'd been paying for 3 years, trying to deal with guilt that Brenda had deliberately created and fed. She wrote about the birthdays Brenda forgot, and the holidays Brenda ruined with her tears about being poor and alone. Writing it all out took Kendall 4 hours, and by the end she had 6 pages of single-spaced text documenting exactly what had been taken from her beyond just money. She brought the letter to our next therapy session, and Adelaide asked if she wanted to read it out loud. Kendall's voice broke multiple times as she read through the list of sacrifices and manipulations, and by the time she finished, we were all crying. Adelaide pointed out that seeing it all written down made the scope of the abuse clear, in a way that individual incidents never had. After hearing Kendall read her letter, Alan said he wanted to write one too, but unlike Kendall, he wanted to send his to Brenda. Adelaide encouraged him to write multiple drafts and bring them to therapy so they could work on the wording together. Alan spent 2 weeks writing and rewriting, and Adelaide helped him cut out anything that sounded like he was explaining or defending his position. The final version was short and clear. It said that Alan loved his mother, but could not have a relationship with her until she took full responsibility for her deception and made genuine amends, not conditional apologies or explanations, but real acknowledgement of harm and concrete steps to make things right. He mailed it on a Tuesday, knowing Brenda probably wouldn't respond the way he hoped, but he said he needed to say it anyway for himself. 2 months after we'd discovered the truth about Brenda's money, Carl called us with news. He and Myra were pregnant, due in 7 months. We were happy for them, But the conversation quickly turned complicated when Carl admitted he was already worried about whether Brenda would be part of his child's life. Myra got on the phone and said clearly that she didn't want Brenda around their baby given the years of manipulation and the stress that had nearly destroyed their marriage. Carl agreed with her, but I could hear the guilt in his voice, and Adelaide spent their next therapy session helping him work through the difference between protecting his child and punishing his mother. She pointed out that keeping Brenda away from the baby wasn't about revenge. It was about creating a safe environment free from manipulation and toxic behavior. The next week, all of us gathered in Adelaide's office to discuss what boundaries around Brenda and the grandchildren should look like going forward. Alan and I decided that Brenda could have supervised visits only with our kids, and she couldn't be alone with them, or give them money or gifts without our approval. Kendall didn't have children yet, but said when she did, Brenda wouldn't have unsupervised access to them either. Carl and Myra decided on no contact with Brenda until after the baby was born, and they'd had time to establish their family without her interference. Adelaide validated that these were reasonable boundaries given Brenda's demonstrated behavior and her complete lack of genuine remorse. She reminded us that protecting our children from someone who'd proven themselves willing to manipulate and exploit family members wasn't cruel. It was responsible parenting. A week later, Carl brought an unopened envelope to therapy. Brenda had somehow found out about the pregnancy and sent a card with a check for $5,000 for the baby. Carl hadn't opened it, but he could feel the check inside the card. We all agreed it was another manipulation attempt. Brenda using money to force her way back into our lives and establish a relationship with Carl's child on her terms. Adelaide asked Carl what he wanted to do, and he said he wanted to send it back unopened. He wrote return to sender on the envelope right there in Adelaide's office and dropped it in the mailbox on his way home. Myra called me that night and said she was proud of him for not being bought, that $5,000 would have made a real difference with baby expenses, but accepting it would have meant letting Brenda back in. 3 months after the hospital confrontation, Kendall got a call from one of Brenda's neighbors, an older woman named Dorothy who lived in the apartment next door. Dorothy said she was calling because she was worried about Kendall and wanted to check on her. Apparently, Brenda had been telling everyone in the building that her children had stolen all her money and abandoned her when she'd needed them most. Dorothy said she'd always thought Kendall was such a nice girl when she used to visit and clean Brenda's apartment, and she couldn't believe Kendall would do something so cruel. Kendall's hands started shaking as she realized Brenda was now playing victim to the entire neighborhood, creating a whole new audience for her performance. She called me immediately, and I could hear the anger in her voice. But when she brought it up in therapy, Adelaide pointed out that this was completely predictable. Brenda needed an audience for her act, and if her children wouldn't participate anymore, she'd find new people to manipulate with her stories. Kendall spent that evening at her laptop composing a response to Dorothy. She drafted 3 different versions before settling on one that felt right. The final email explained calmly that Brenda had substantial assets, including investment accounts and rental properties that her children only recently discovered. Kendall wrote that they hadn't stolen anything, and that Brenda had been deceiving them about her financial situation for years. She kept it factual without going into the painful details of cruises and hidden cars and 8 years of manufactured crises. Dorothy wrote back the next morning apologizing for believing Brenda's version of events. She mentioned that several other neighbors had noticed things didn't quite add up about Brenda's stories over the years. One neighbor saw Brenda getting into a taxi wearing expensive jewelry right after crying poverty at the building's community meeting. Another noticed Brenda's mail included cruise line brochures while she claimed to be too sick and poor to travel anywhere. Kendall felt vindicated reading Dorothy's response, but also deeply sad that her mother's dishonesty reached so far beyond just family. Brenda had been performing this act for an entire apartment building full of people who genuinely cared about her. Alan got a call from his boss 2 days later asking if everything was okay, because Alan seemed distracted at work lately. Alan realized with a jolt that he'd been so consumed with processing his mother's betrayal that his job performance was slipping. He'd missed a deadline last week and forgot about a meeting yesterday. His boss wasn't angry but concerned, asking if there was a family emergency or something going on that Alan needed time to handle. Alan thanked him for checking in and admitted there was a difficult family situation he was working through. His boss suggested Alan take a personal day to clear his head and get centered again. Alan agreed and spent the following day with me and the kids doing something fun instead of dwelling on Brenda. We went to the zoo and got ice cream and played mini golf. I watched my husband actively choose to focus on the family he built, rather than the mother who betrayed him. He laughed at our son's terrible putting skills and helped our daughter feed the giraffes and didn't check his phone once to see if Brenda had called. It was a small turning point, but an important one. Our next therapy session with Adelaide focused on what each of us needed to move forward separate from what Brenda did or didn't do. Adelaide pointed out that we'd been so focused on Brenda's actions and potential apologies that we hadn't considered our own healing independent of her. She asked each person to think about what they needed personally to feel okay again, regardless of whether Brenda ever changed. Alan said he needed to forgive himself for not seeing the deception sooner. He'd been beating himself up for being fooled for 8 years when looking back there were signs he should have noticed. Adelaide reminded him that skilled manipulators are good at hiding their deceptions, and that trusting your mother isn't a character flaw. Carl said he needed to rebuild trust with Myra, and prove through consistent actions that he'd prioritize his wife and child over his mother's demands going forward. Myra squeezed his hand when he said it. Kendall said she needed to finish paying off the loan and start saving for her own future, without letting resentment consume her every time she made a payment. She wanted to reclaim her financial independence from Brenda's manipulation. I realized I needed to support Alan without pushing him toward reconciliation with Brenda before he was ready. I'd been wanting to fix things and make the family whole again, but that wasn't my job or my decision to make. We started having regular sibling dinners after that session without the therapy structure. Just the three of them plus spouses getting together to reconnect as adults, rather than as Brenda's children competing for approval. The first dinner was a little awkward because they'd never just hung out socially without some Brenda crisis hanging over them. But by the second dinner, they were laughing together and sharing stories about their kids and jobs and lives that had nothing to do with their mother. Carl talked about a funny thing that happened at work. Kendall showed us pictures from a weekend trip she took with her boyfriend. Alan told stories about our kids' latest school adventures. They laughed together for the first time in months. Carl commented that they never just hung out like this before because they were always too busy running to Brenda's latest emergency. There was always a roof that needed fixing, or a utility bill that needed paying, or some crisis that required immediate attention. Now they had time to actually be siblings instead of Brenda's unpaid staff. Kendall made an appointment with a financial advisor named Scott Beyer to create a plan for paying off the loan early and rebuilding her savings. She brought all her financial documents to his office, feeling nervous about how bad her situation might look on paper. Scott spent an hour going through everything with her and asking questions about her income and expenses and goals. He helped her see that at 32, she still had plenty of time to recover financially from this setback. He created a realistic budget that would have her debt-free in 18 months instead of 3 years if she made some adjustments to her spending. Kendall could increase her loan payments by redirecting money she used to send to Brenda every month. She could pick up some freelance work in her field to earn extra income specifically for debt repayment. Scott also helped her see that once the loan was paid off, she could start saving aggressively for a house and wedding in future. Kendall left his office feeling genuinely hopeful for the first time since discovering Brenda's lies. She felt like she was taking control of her life back from her mother's manipulation, instead of just being a victim of it. 4 months after the hospital confrontation, Brenda made a different kind of contact. She had her lawyer send letters to all 3 children offering to return $50,000 to each of them if they agreed to resume regular contact and caregiving. The letter was carefully worded to frame it as Brenda wanting to make amends and repair the relationship, but the conditions attached made it crystal clear this was another attempt at control. The money came with strings requiring weekly visits and helping with household tasks and being available for emergencies. Alan brought his letter to our next therapy session, and Carl and Kendall brought theirs too. We spread them out on Adelaide's coffee table and she read through them carefully. She pointed out that this wasn't an apology or genuine amends. This was a bribe. Brenda was trying to buy her way back into their lives on her terms, using the very money she'd manipulated from them in the first place. The letters didn't acknowledge any wrongdoing or express remorse for the 8 years of lies. They just offered money in exchange for the children going back to their old roles. The 3 siblings discussed the offer seriously in therapy, because $50,000 each would make a real difference in their lives. It would pay off Kendall's loan completely with money left over for savings. It would help Carl and Myra with baby expenses and getting the nursery ready. It would replenish our kids' college fund that we depleted sending money to Brenda. Adelaide let them talk through the pros and cons without judgment. But accepting the money would mean going back to the dynamic where Brenda used financial transactions to control their behavior and access to their lives. It would mean teaching their children that manipulation is acceptable if the price is right. It would mean abandoning all the boundaries they'd worked so hard to establish over the past 4 months. After a long discussion that took up most of the therapy session, the siblings unanimously decided to decline the offer. Adelaide told them this was a major milestone in their healing. Choosing emotional health and autonomy over money showed real growth and commitment to breaking the cycle Brenda had created. Alan drafted a response and hired his own lawyer to send it so the communication stayed formal and documented. The letter stated clearly that he and his siblings declined the financial offer. It said that any future relationship with Brenda must be based on honest communication and mutual respect rather than financial transactions. Alan wrote that they were willing to have supervised contact. Brenda took genuine responsibility for her actions without explanations or excuses. But they wouldn't accept conditional apologies or financial manipulation as substitutes for real accountability. The letter set terms for the first time instead of just reacting to Brenda's moves. Sending it through his lawyer felt powerful and official. Alan kept a copy in a folder with all the other documentation from this situation. He said it felt good to finally be setting boundaries instead of having them trampled. Brenda responded through her lawyer 2 weeks later. Her letter said she didn't understand why her children were being so cruel to her. She claimed she was only trying to help by offering money and couldn't comprehend why they would reject her generosity. The letter expressed confusion about why her children were punishing her for trying to make things right. There was still no acknowledgement of the 8 years of deception. No recognition that she'd systematically lied to and exploited her children while sitting on millions of dollars. Just bewilderment that they wouldn't accept her latest manipulation attempt. Carl read Brenda's response out loud in therapy, and then said he was done waiting for an apology that would never come. He'd been holding on to hope that eventually Brenda would have some moment of clarity and genuine remorse. But this response made it clear she either couldn't or wouldn't see what she'd done wrong. Kendall agreed, saying she needed to accept that their mother was never going to be the person they needed her to be. Brenda was always going to see herself as the victim in this situation. 5 months after discovering the truth, Alan had a breakthrough in therapy. Adelaide had been gently pushing him to examine what exactly he was grieving, because his sadness seemed deeper than just anger about the money. Alan finally put words to something he'd been circling around for weeks. He said he'd been grieving not just the betrayal, but the loss of the mother he thought he had. The mother who called crying about groceries had never actually existed. That was a character Brenda played to manipulate him. He said out loud that his real mother, the one who actually exists, is someone who views her children as resources to exploit, rather than people to love. She's someone who would rather lie and manipulate than have an honest relationship with her own kids. Saying it out loud made Alan cry harder than I'd seen him cry through this whole ordeal, but afterward he seemed lighter somehow. His shoulders weren't as tense. He looked at me and said he felt like he'd been fighting against reality for 5 months, trying to make Brenda into someone she wasn't. Accepting who she actually is felt terrible, but also freeing in a way he hadn't expected. A few weeks after Alan's breakthrough, Kendall brought up something new in therapy that had her completely stressed out. She'd started seeing someone she met through mutual friends, and things were going really well, but she had no idea how to explain the whole Brenda situation without scaring him off. Adelaide asked her what she was afraid would happen if she told him the truth, and Kendall said she worried he'd think her family was too messed up, or that she was damaged goods because of her mother. Adelaide pointed out that hiding major life events usually caused more problems than being honest, and encouraged Kendall to share the story early, rather than waiting until they were more serious. Kendall decided to tell him on their 4th date over dinner at an Italian place near her apartment. She texted me afterward from the restaurant bathroom saying she'd just explained everything about Brenda and was waiting to see if he ran for the hills. 20 minutes later, she called me from her car crying, but in a good way. Her boyfriend had listened to the whole story, and instead of judging her, he'd opened up about his own family problems with an alcoholic father who'd stolen money from him multiple times. They'd spent 2 hours talking about having complicated relationships with parents and what it meant to set boundaries with people you're supposed to love unconditionally. Kendall kept saying she couldn't believe someone saw her as more than just her family drama and actually understood what she'd been through. I told her this was what healthy relationships looked like when both people brought their real selves, instead of pretending everything was perfect. 2 months later, Carl called us at 6 in the morning to say Myra had gone into labor and they were heading to the hospital. Alan and I got the kids ready for school and spent the whole day checking our phones for updates. At 2 in the afternoon, Carl sent a photo of a tiny baby girl with a full head of dark hair, and the text said, "Charlotte Marie Coleman born at 1:47 p.m., 7 pounds 4 ounces, everyone healthy." We were planning to visit that evening after Carl and Myra had some time to rest, but at 4 o'clock Carl called again and his voice was tight with anger. Brenda had somehow found out about the birth and sent a massive flower arrangement to the hospital with a card that said, "From Grandma who loves you even if your parents won't let me meet you." Carl said the nurses wheeled it into Myra's room and Myra started crying because she'd just given birth and didn't want to deal with Brenda's manipulation. Carl had the flowers removed immediately and asked to speak with the charge nurse. He explained briefly that his mother wasn't welcome to visit and had been financially abusive to the family. The nurse didn't ask for details but made a note in the computer system that Brenda Coleman was not approved for any visits or information about the patient or baby. Having that boundary enforced by hospital staff instead of just family made Carl feel like he wasn't crazy for protecting his daughter from her grandmother. We visited that evening and Myra looked exhausted, but happy holding Charlotte while Carl sat next to the bed looking at his daughter like she was the most amazing thing he'd ever seen. Alan held his niece and got emotional talking about how she deserved to grow up without manipulation and guilt trips. I could see Carl and Myra exchanging looks, and knew they were thinking about what role Brenda would play in Charlotte's life. Over the next 2 weeks, while Carl and Myra adjusted to having a newborn at home, they talked through their options in therapy with Adelaide. They didn't want to completely cut Brenda off from her grandchild, but they also refused to expose Charlotte to the toxic patterns that had damaged them. Adelaide helped them come up with a plan for supervised visits with strict conditions and clear consequences. Carl sent Brenda an email 2 weeks after Charlotte was born, laying out the terms. She could meet the baby at their home, not at a restaurant or Brenda's apartment. The visit would last 1 hour maximum with a clear start and end time. If Brenda made any guilt trips about being kept away, or brought up money, or tried to manipulate anyone, the visit would end immediately. Carl copied Alan and me on the email and asked if we'd be willing to be there as backup in case things went wrong. We agreed right away because we wanted to support them, and also because I was curious to see if Brenda could actually follow boundaries for 60 minutes. Brenda responded within an hour saying she'd love to meet her granddaughter and would follow whatever rules they wanted. The visit was scheduled for the following Saturday at 2 p.m. Carl and Myra spent the morning cleaning their house even though it was already clean and talking through their plan. Alan and I arrived at 1:30 to be there before Brenda showed up. At exactly 2 o'clock, Brenda knocked on the door carrying an enormous stuffed giraffe that was nearly as tall as she was. Carl opened the door, and Brenda immediately started crying about how she'd been kept from her grandchild and how much she'd missed. Carl's voice was completely calm when he reminded her of the conditions they'd discussed and said if she wanted to meet Charlotte, she needed to stop the guilt trips right now. Brenda wiped her eyes and switched to cooing about how excited she was to finally meet the baby. Myra brought Charlotte out from the nursery, and Brenda reached for her, but Myra handed the baby to Carl first. Carl held Charlotte for a minute, making it clear that he was in control of this visit, then carefully placed his daughter in Brenda's arms. Brenda sat on the couch and rocked Charlotte while making grandmother noises about how beautiful she was and how much she looked like Carl as a baby. For about 10 minutes, everything seemed fine, and I started to think maybe Brenda could actually behave. Then she looked up at Carl with tears in her eyes again and started talking about how sad she was that her children had cut her off over a misunderstanding and how she'd missed so much already. Myra stood up and took Charlotte back from Brenda without saying a word. Carl told his mother that the visit was over and she needed to leave. Brenda's face shifted from sad to angry in a second, and she demanded to know why she was punished when she'd followed all their rules. Carl walked to the door and opened it, saying she'd lasted 10 minutes before breaking the one rule about not guilt-tripping, and she could try again in a few months if she wanted to follow the actual conditions. Brenda grabbed her purse and the giant giraffe and left without saying goodbye. After she was gone, Carl sat down on the couch and put his head in his hands, but when he looked up, he was smiling a little. He said it felt good to enforce a boundary and actually follow through with consequences instead of just threatening them. At their next therapy session, Adelaide helped Carl and Myra talk through what had happened and what it meant for future contact with Brenda. They decided that visits would be equally structured going forward, and very infrequent, maybe only on major holidays, and always with the same conditions. Carl said something during that session that stuck with me. He told Adelaide he was sad that his daughter wouldn't have the grandmother he wished he'd had, but he was protecting her from the grandmother he actually had. That acceptance of reality instead of hoping Brenda would change felt like real healing. 6 months after we discovered Brenda's lies in the hospital, we hosted Thanksgiving at our house for the first time ever. Usually we'd gone to Brenda's apartment where she'd serve a dry turkey and complain about how expensive everything was while we all pretended not to notice the manipulation. This year it was just us, Alan's siblings and their families, and nobody had to walk on eggshells. Kendall showed up early to help cook and brought her boyfriend, who fit right in with everyone. Carl and Myra came with Charlotte, who was now rolling over and grabbing everything. Our kids were excited to have their cousins around, and the house was loud with actual happiness instead of tense silence. While we were cooking together in the kitchen, Alan looked around at all of us and said this was what family was supposed to feel like. He said it felt supportive and genuine instead of everyone waiting for the next manufactured crisis or guilt trip. Kendall agreed and added that she was grateful for her brothers and for all of us choosing honesty over Brenda's games. Even though Brenda wasn't there, we could all feel her absence in a good way, like a weight had been lifted. During dinner, we went around the table doing the traditional thing where everyone says what they're thankful for. Alan said he was grateful for his wife and kids and for siblings who stood together through a terrible situation, instead of letting Brenda divide them. Carl said he was thankful for Myra never giving up on him, even when he was choosing his mother's fake emergencies over his marriage. And he was thankful for baby Charlotte, who'd given him a chance to break the cycle. Kendall said she was thankful for therapy and for finally understanding that her mother's inability to love her properly was never her fault, and never would be. Our teenage kids said they were thankful for video games and their friends, and being able to save for college now. The normal things they were grateful for reminded us why protecting them from Brenda's toxicity mattered so much. After dinner, we played board games and watched football, and it was the most relaxed holiday any of us could remember. The Monday after Thanksgiving, Alan got a group email from Brenda saying she was hurt that she wasn't included in the holiday. She wrote that she was their mother and deserved respect regardless of what had happened. The email said she was willing to forget everything and move forward if they would just come back to being a normal family. Alan showed me the email and asked what I thought he should say. I told him the truth, which was that Brenda still wasn't taking any real responsibility and was trying to rug sweep 8 years of lies. Alan wrote back a short response saying they were willing to have limited contact if she acknowledged specifically what she did wrong and why it was harmful without any explanations or excuses. He sent it to Carl and Kendall first, and they both approved, so he hit send. We waited for Brenda to respond, but she never did. Her silence told us everything we needed to know about whether she was actually willing to change. In early December, Kendall called me from her car crying with relief. She'd just made the final payment on the loan she took out for Brenda's fake roof repair. Thanks to the financial plan Scott had helped her create, she'd paid it off 18 months earlier than the original schedule. She kept saying she felt free, like Brenda didn't have control over her finances anymore. We took Kendall out to dinner that weekend to celebrate, and she talked about her plans to start saving for a house. She also mentioned that her boyfriend had brought up moving in together, and maybe getting engaged next year if things kept going well. Watching her talk about the future instead of being stuck in the past made me so proud of how far she'd come. She'd gone from drowning in debt and guilt to planning a life on her own terms. Right before Christmas, Alan came home from work with news that made both of us cry happy tears. He'd gotten a promotion with a big raise that would increase our household income by almost 20%. His boss had pulled him into the office and told him his focus and performance over the past few months had been excellent. Alan realized later that not being constantly stressed about Brenda's crises had made him better at his job. He wasn't working overtime to send her money anymore, and he wasn't distracted by guilt and worry. The raise meant we could fully fund our kids' college accounts again and start putting money toward retirement. We went out to dinner, just the two of us, to celebrate. and Alan told me he felt lighter than he had in years. He said he felt like he was finally living his own life instead of existing as Brenda's emergency fund and emotional support system. A few weeks later, Carl called Alan and asked if we'd be godparents to Charlotte, and we both said yes immediately. The baptism happened on a Sunday morning at the church where Carl and Myra got married and Brenda wasn't invited. Walking into that church and seeing it filled with Myra's family and friends who'd supported them through the pregnancy and Brenda drama made me realize this was what family should look like. These were people who showed up honestly without manufacturing crises or demanding payment for their presence. During the ceremony, I held Alan's hand and watched Carl and Myra standing at the altar with their daughter, and felt grateful that they'd built this community of genuine support. The priest talked about commitment and love, and I glanced around at all these faces of people who'd brought meals and babysat, and listened to Carl vent about his mother without judgment. After the ceremony, we had lunch at Carl and Myra's house, and everyone laughed and played with Charlotte, and nobody mentioned Brenda once. It felt lighter than any family gathering had felt in years, because we weren't walking on eggshells or managing anyone's feelings or bracing for the next guilt trip. The next week, we had our therapy session with Adelaide, and she told us we'd made remarkable progress in the 7 months since discovering Brenda's lies. She said we'd established healthy boundaries and processed the betrayal in ways that would protect us going forward. Adelaide suggested we start spacing sessions to monthly instead of weekly, because we'd learned the tools we needed. Alan looked nervous and said he worried about having less support, but Adelaide reminded him that he had his siblings and his wife, and he'd proven he could handle difficult situations. She said we could always come back if we needed to, but she thought we were ready to manage on our own. Walking out of her office that day, Alan squeezed my hand and said he felt proud of the work we'd done. I told him I was proud too and that we'd keep supporting each other no matter what. 2 days later, Kendall called me from her car and I could hear the excitement in her voice before she even spoke. She told me her boyfriend had proposed and she'd said yes and she was engaged. I screamed and congratulated her and she started crying happy tears through the phone. Then she asked if Alan would walk her down the aisle since their father was gone, and she didn't want Brenda involved in that role. I told her Alan would be honored and put her on speaker so Alan could hear. He got emotional and told Kendall he'd be proud to walk her down the aisle. Kendall explained that she was inviting Brenda to the wedding because it felt wrong to exclude her completely, but Brenda would sit in the back and wouldn't be in photos or give a speech. If Brenda caused any drama, security would remove her immediately. Kendall said having a clear plan made her feel in control instead of anxious about what Brenda might do. Alan told Kendall he was so happy for her and that she deserved this joy after everything she'd been through. The wedding planning became something that brought all of us closer together over the next few months. Kendall asked me to go dress shopping with her, and we spent a Saturday trying on gowns and laughing and eating lunch together. Myra helped Kendall pick out flowers and decorations, and they spent hours looking at Pinterest boards and calling vendors. Alan and Carl planned the rehearsal dinner and argued good-naturedly about whether to have it at a restaurant or rent a private room. We were all invested in making Kendall's day perfect, and the focus on celebrating her happiness instead of managing Brenda's feelings felt refreshing. Kendall glowed with excitement every time we got together, and she said this was the family she'd always wanted. She told me one afternoon while we were addressing invitations that having people show up for her without strings attached or guilt trips was something she'd never experienced before. I watched her smile while she wrote out addresses and realized how far she'd come from the guilt-ridden woman who'd been in therapy for years because of Brenda. 3 weeks before the wedding, Kendall got a card in the mail from Brenda. Inside was a note saying Brenda would pay for the entire wedding if Kendall would let her be mother of the bride properly. Brenda wanted to sit in the front row and give a speech and be in all the photos. Kendall called me right after reading it and said she didn't even hesitate before deciding to decline. She told Brenda through email that she was welcome to attend as a guest with the boundaries already stated or not attend at all, but there would be no negotiations. Brenda tried calling Kendall multiple times that day, but Kendall didn't answer. She tried again the next day with the crying voice Kendall recognized from years of manipulation, but Kendall blocked the number. Carl called Kendall that evening to tell her he was proud of her for not being bought, and Kendall said she'd learned from watching him return the baby money Brenda had sent. The 3 siblings talked on a group call that night and agreed that Brenda's latest attempt proved she still didn't understand that relationships couldn't be purchased. 8 months after the hospital confrontation, the 3 siblings sat down at our kitchen table and created a formal written plan for handling Brenda going forward. They agreed on supervised contact only with no exceptions and no financial transactions in either direction ever again. If Brenda tried manipulation tactics, there would be immediate consequences, including reduced contact or no contact for a period of time. They wrote everything down on paper and each took a copy home. Having it documented made them feel like they had a united front that Brenda couldn't break through by playing them against each other. Alan said for the first time he didn't feel guilty about the boundaries, because he wasn't punishing his mother but protecting the life and family he'd built. Carl agreed and said he felt the same way about protecting Myra and Charlotte. Kendall said she finally understood that setting boundaries wasn't mean or cruel, but necessary for her own mental health and future happiness. Kendall's wedding day arrived on a beautiful Saturday in October and everything looked perfect. The venue was decorated with fall flowers and candles, and Kendall looked stunning in her dress. Brenda showed up and sat quietly in the back row just like Kendall had specified, and for once she didn't make a scene. Maybe she realized she was on thin ice, or maybe she was planning her next move, but either way she behaved herself. Kendall walked down the aisle on Alan's arm, and I watched my husband cry as he gave his sister away to someone who genuinely loved her. The ceremony was beautiful and personal, and afterward we all celebrated with dancing and good food and speeches from people who actually cared about Kendall. During the reception, Kendall gave a speech thanking her brothers for always being there, and for teaching her that family is about who shows up honestly, not who shares your blood. She said Carl and Alan had protected her and supported her, and shown her what real love looks like. There wasn't a dry eye in the room, and I saw Carl and Myra holding hands, and Alan wiping tears from his face. Now it's been 6 months since we discovered Brenda's deception, and our lives have genuinely improved in ways I couldn't have imagined back in that hospital room. Alan is thriving at work and actually present with our kids instead of constantly stressed and distracted by his mother's manufactured emergencies. Carl and Myra's marriage is stronger than ever, and they're amazing parents to Charlotte, who just started crawling last week. Kendall is happily married and completely debt-free, and talking about buying a house next year. We still see Brenda occasionally under the strict conditions we established, and she still can't genuinely apologize or take real responsibility, but we've accepted that's who she is. We chose our own peace and happiness over her manipulation, and that choice freed us in ways that money never could. The 3 siblings are closer than ever, and they support each other as adults rather than competing for a mother's approval that was never real to begin with. We're building our own family traditions based on honesty and genuine care, and teaching our kids that love isn't about obligation or guilt, but about showing up authentically for the people who matter. That's the real inheritance worth having, and it's something Brenda's millions could never buy.